C.T. Studd, cricketer for Christ. The first mission I worked with, Hospital Christian Fellowship, C.T. Studd was very much the example. It was lifted up, and the amount of times Francis Grimm would refer to C.T. Studd and quote from him, it was a key part of my early missionary mentorship. And as we seek to put feature, I think we want to learn from examples of excellence. Now, I've got two sources for this presentation, two books. Cricketer for Christ, I'm using that as the title, but I'm taking the parts that are in yellow from C.T. Studd, Cricketer and Pioneer, written by his son-in-law, Norman Grubb. And the second source, those which are in white text, come from Reluctant Missionary, written by his daughter, Edith Buxton. I must say, one of the most delightful, unorthodox, brutally honest, and humorous missionary biographies I've ever read. Reluctant Missionary, Edith Buxton. I had a copy earlier as a new Christian, which I lost over 40 years ago, and when I was up in Northern Ireland ministering with the Martyr Memorial Church, I was taken to second-hand a bookshop by Ian Paisley, and I discovered this book again, and I've got my second copy, which is more treasured now, and I'm going to be careful not to lose that one. And that's all in the white text. So you can tell the difference between whether I'm quoting from Edith Buxton, his daughter, or from Norman Grubb, his son-in-law. So, Edith Buxton was one of four daughters of the famous English cricketer turned pioneer missionary Charles T. Studd. C.T. Studd had captained at Eton and Cambridge cricket teams and then played for the All English in Australia. Now, Eton was a high school, Cambridge was a university, and so he was top. I mean, Eton and Cambridge, these are some of the top schools that you could get in England. And then he had been in the English cricket team against the Australians. He was converted during the evangelical revival of 1880 under the ministry of D.L. Moody, Dwight Moody. He gave up everything and he went as a missionary to China in 1885. There he met Priscilla Stewart. And all four of their children were born in the heart of China. C.T. Studd was the third of four sons, born to Edward and Doris Studd. Edward Studd was dead serious about horse racing. Not content with winning several steeplechases, he set his heart on the Grand National, and he won this race with his horse Salamander. Charles Studd was raised in great privilege in England, and from his earliest years he was involved in sports, particularly fox hunting, horse racing, and cricket. Aside from horse racing, the Studd family engaged in hunting in the winter and cricket in the summer, and Edward Studd had a first-class cricket pitch made at the back of his house. Imagine they had more space than most of us. His three eldest sons grew up to achieve fame at Eton by all being in cricket 11 together. And Charles, along with his two elder brothers, received the most exclusive education in the country at Eton, where they excelled at cricket, creating a record where each brother captained the Eton cricket team in succession. Absolutely unheard of. Life was very pleasant, comfortable, and promising for the boys until their father, Edward Studd, heard D.L. Moody, and nothing was the same after Edward Studd became a Christian. It was 1876. Edward was invited to hear American evangelist D.L. Moody. Moody's sermons were described as very much to the point. Edward Studd was 56 years old when he attended Moody and Sankey's outreach at Drury Lane Theatre. Now, Sankey was the song leader, Moody was the preacher, and they made a formidable team, and maybe you've even come across some of Sankey's hymns. You've probably sung quite a few of them. It was a decisive experience. He experienced a radical religious conversion. His whole way of life changed. In order to express his new faith with all the energy and enthusiasm of which he was capable, he gave up all his questionable pursuits, particularly gambling, invested his immense wealth and influence into winning others for Christ. The boys were shocked at the change they saw in their father. He withdrew from horse racing. Then he rode around the countryside to urge his neighbours to come in on Sunday evenings. And they came in the hundreds, filling up the staircases to the first floor, leaning over the balconies to hear the fellows he got to come from London to speak to him. Moody himself came to his house. As Edward had never done anything by halves, he now threw himself into the saving of the souls of his friends and relatives. The evangelical message of those revival days was forthright, and as delivered by Edward, more like a sword thrust than a message. Are you saved? If not, you're going to hell. That's a fact. He spoke fearlessly to anyone and everyone on salvation through trusting in Christ. He gave generously wherever there was need. Even to the gift of a house in America to his friend D.L. Moody, when he contributed largely to the founding of the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago for the training of missionaries for the foreign field. In fact, basically, Moody Bible Institute was built by the Studd family's donations. Edward lived for only 2 years after his conversion. But it was said of him that in those 2 years, he worked wholeheartedly for the kingdom of God, and he accomplished more than most Christians do in a lifetime. C.T. studied at Cambridge. And then, when his second brother George was seriously ill and believed to be dying, C.T. Studd considered, what is all the fame and the flattery worth? Vanity of vanities, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Edith Buxton described her father, who was known by his initials C.T. He was the third son of Edward Studd. C.T. captained the Eton 11 in 1879 and the Cambridge University 11 in 1882. Later, he is an English team that went to Australia to retrieve the Ashes. If you know what the Ashes were, in the cricket match between Australia's cricket team and the English cricket team, the Australians won. And so the English team burned the cricket stubs and put the ashes in a cup because the glory had turned to ashes, and they gave the cup to the Australians. And now it was the job of the English to try and retrieve the ashes back. And so if you've heard of the Ashes, that's what they're talking about. So the first time the English invented cricket, lost. And so that's the origin of it. Well, C.T. Studd's team returned back to England with the urn, with the Ashes. They beat Australia. And this is the team. And when you look at this team, you can see C.T. Studd sitting there with his arms folded, quite a self-confident young man heading to a promising career. And where is he in this picture? I'm not sure, but it could be him on the far left. And here we do know, because it's named, this is the English team, and he's at the back right, standing up there with his arms folded again, and that's identified here, the 1884 English cricket team. Charles Studd had the world at his feet. While on a cricket tour in Australia, his brother Charles claimed close to death through a severe illness, and this affected Charles. Edith remembers his father describing his conversion in these words: I had the good fortune to meet a real, live, play the game Christian. It was my own father. But it did make one's hair stand on end. Everyone in the house had a dog's life of it until they got converted. He was always asking about our souls, and we did not like it. Attending a meeting of D.L. Moody, C.T. Studd was brought to a position of full surrender to Christ. And from this point on, his life was never the same, and he was possessed by a consuming passion to lead people to Christ. His brother George did recover, and C.T. went to hear D.L. Moody once again. And as a result, he gave up cricket and dedicated himself to the saving of souls. Charles now regarded the first 6 years of his Christian experience as being in a backslidden condition. Now he yearned to be absolute in his service for the Lord. C.T. shocked his family when he became one of the famed Cambridge 7 missionary volunteers of the China Inland Mission. And here you can see C.T. Studd, top left. And they're all wearing Chinese garb, which was the policy of Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission. He met Hudson Taylor and answered the call to be a missionary to China. In this, he is joined by 6 other Cambridge students who made a huge impact on the secular and the religious world, becoming religious celebrities known as the Cambridge 7. He chose to join Hudson Taylor's mission to China. Now, C.T. was described as no orator, but he was tireless and he had a forthright manner of speaking. It's blunt. These 7 young aristocrats, 2 of them famous athletes, another 2 military officers, forsaking the comforts of England to work with an until then unknown missionary society in the hinterland, inland of China, was a story the press could not pass up. The Cambridge 7 helped to catapult China Inland Mission from obscurity to embarrassing prominence, and inspired hundreds of other recruits for China Inland Mission and other missionary societies. Stanley Peregrine Smith was the captain of the Cambridge rowing team, and he's one of the most famous men in England. He also was converted in one of D.L. Moody's revivals and helped to found the Cambridge Christian Union. Stanley Smith was the orator of the setting. Dixon Hooster, the son of a major general, was an officer in the Royal Artillery, was also converted during the Moody campaign. He gave himself to Christ as completely as he had given himself to soldiering. Cecil Polhill Turner was an officer in the Royal Dragoons cavalry. His brother Arthur was studying to become a minister. William Wharton Castles was an ordained Church of England minister. And Charles Studd was the most famous of all, the unbeatable cricket captain, the most brilliant member of a well-known cricketing family, as the press described him. With much fanfare, these religious celebrities toured the British Isles, attracting huge crowds with much media attention. And perhaps some of this went to the head because on the long boat ride to China, which was nearly 6 months, they refused to study and prayed to receive the Chinese language supernaturally. Hudson Taylor warned them this is one of Satan's devices to keep the Chinese people ignorant of the gospel. When they finally reached China in 1885 and the Chinese language did not miraculously descend upon them, they finally knuckled down to study. In China, they were immediately struck with the degradation that opium had dragged so much of the population down to. Many people sold everything, furniture, roof tiles, agricultural tools, even their wives and children, into slavery to satisfy their craving for drugs. One of the strategies of the Cambridge Seven was to seek to reach these opium addicts for Christ. They established opium refuges where addicts could come to stay for 3 to 6 weeks and find deliverance from this addiction. Each of the 7 reacted very differently to China. William Castles, the ordained clergyman, was appalled by the lack of church rules, and within a year, he and Arthur Polhill Turner left China Inland Mission to found a Church of England diocese in Sichuan. Cecil Polhill Turner also left after a year and became a wandering missionary with the goal of being the first missionary to Tibet. Stanley Smith was soon casting out demons and offended the local Chinese, abandoned the unobtrusive style of the China Inland Mission evangelism, and began parading through villages with banners and gongs like a Salvation Army band. He eventually embraced the Buddhist ideal of the larger hope that all humanity would ultimately be saved, universalism. And ultimately, Smith departed from the doctrinal foundations of CIM so seriously that he was compelled to resign. Dixon Hooster was the most stable and successful of the 7. He stayed the course. As a wise and patient missionary, he served the Chinese with great distinction, and he earned their love and trust. Dixon Hooster, in fact, was the successor to Hudson Taylor and became the next director of China Inland Mission. Charles Studd married an Irish Salvation Army officer, Priscilla Stewart. From the beginning, they suffered severe persecution, and he later reported that for the first 5 years in China, every time they stepped outside the doors, they were greeted with curses. In China, foreign and devil was a compound noun. Foreign devils and blue-eyed devils. And these were the kind of terms that used. Xenophobia was almost invented in China. If not invented, they certainly perfected it. To cope with such hostility, a sense of humor is essential, as seen in these examples. C.T. Studd presented this parable. Remember the miller's donkey. The miller, his son, his donkey went to the market. And the miller rode all the way, and the people slammed, "Cruel man, riding himself, making his son walk." So he got down, and the son rode. Then the man slammed, "Well, what a lazy son for riding while his poor old father walks." So both father and son rode. The people said, "Cruelty to animals, poor donkey." So they got down, they carried the donkey on a pole, and the people said, "Now here, 2 asses carrying another ass." So all 3 walked, and the people said, "What fools to have a donkey and not to ride it?" So, he said, let's get ahead with our work for God, and let's not care what folks say. In other words, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be criticized anyway. As C.T. Studd said, had I cared for the comments of people, I should never have been a missionary. If you're not being criticized, you're not doing your job. Nevertheless, Charles saw many people converted and numerous opium addicts delivered, and his total dedication to China Inland Mission's principle of living by faith was seen that when he inherited a fortune of over £25,000, which would be several $1 million today. He promptly invested it in the bank of heaven. He gave it all away. He gave his entire inheritance as gifts to the Salvation Army, D.L. Moody's Bible College in Chicago, and to George Muller's orphanage. He preached Christ as though he would never preach again, as a dying man to dying men. George Muller's orphanage benefited dramatically from C.T. Studd's donation. The Moody Bible Institute was able to expand with C.T. Studd's donation. And General William Booth was able to send 50 Salvation Army missionaries to India. Now, it would have been reasonable for C.T. Studd to keep something back to sustain his family, but that wasn't his way. He gave it all away, so he'd have to live by faith. And when he encouraged his wife to keep her inheritance, she said, "I'm not going to be outdone by you," and she gave it all away as well. So, when after 10 years in China, he was invalided home with typhoid, his friends doubted whether he had ever reached England alive. There goes a dying man, they said. However, C.T. Studd did recover, but he suffered with asthma for the rest of his life. In spite of his physical strength as an athlete, Charles did not enjoy good health in the mission field. In 1893, he almost died. He was forced to return to England with his wife and 4 daughters, who had all been born in China. When in 1895 he returned from China, his family tried to persuade him to join the Church of England, but he dug in his heels. Father was not like that. He was not a man to join one particular church. He believed in any church or community which loved Jesus Christ in sincerity. He traveled around Britain, stirring up interest in missions, and in 1896 he was invited to the United States to help launch the Student Volunteer Missionary Union, out of which grew the Student Volunteer or Student Christian Movement, SCM. He stayed in America for 18 months on a speaking tour. Imagine 18 months speaking tour. Sometimes addressing as many as 6 meetings in a day. Many hundreds offered themselves for missions as a result. In 1900, C.T. Studd moved his whole family to England, where he pastored the church for 5 years. And he also joined a cricket tour to have more opportunities to preach to soldiers. In India, he had the privilege of baptizing his 4 daughters, and one of those present at the baptism was Amy Carmichael. Edith Buxton described his Indian summer as her happiest childhood. There were picnics, badminton parties, outings, morning rides with Father, 2 by 2. Father was keen that we would excel at outdoor sports. He did his best to make riders out of us. These were days of moonshine, monsoon, days of brilliant sunshine at an altitude of 8,000 feet. Now, why did the British choose a place at high altitude? Cooler, and of course, less mosquitoes and so on. Sometimes they saw tigers in the jungle nearby. Ill health again forced him to return to England, where his sporting fame still enabled him to draw large crowds. And these he addressed in his usual blunt manner. "I once had another religion, hunting the Bible for hidden truths, but no obedience, no sacrifice. Then came the change. The real thing came before me. Soft speech became crude salt. The parlor game became real cricket on the public ground. Words became deeds. The commands of Christ became not merely Sunday recitations, but battle calls to be obeyed. As St. Decreed was born again into decisive action of obedience." Upon their return to England in 1906, the girls were shipped off to school in Switzerland, where they learned French, and as Edith put it, born in China, home to England, 5 years in India, followed by 1.5 in Switzerland, and now Sherborne. She describes feeling guilty that she did not want to follow her parents. "Secretly, I was at war with myself, undecided, reluctant to throw in my lot with them. Yet I felt a stranger to the world that was shouting its welcome, and poor Father groaned when he took us out, because being a missionary, it was not seemly to have such daughters. As to jewelry, we could never pass a shop without flattening our noses against the windows. Dorothy was always the favorite, anyway with the boys. I felt life was simply not worth living unless I could get the same attention. There were constant jealousies between us. We were often at loggerheads. We had come to love the sounds of London." Edith Buxton describes the years leading up to 1914 as a brilliant decade of strawberries and cream, cricket matches. Remember, cricket matches were 5 days long. I still remember them in Rhodesia. Go to a cricket match for 5 days. Large hats, lace umbrellas, night parties. Her elder sister Grace was always protecting us and, if need be, taking the blame. In 1908 in Liverpool, a notice caught C.T. Studd's eye. His friend, missionary Carl Cum, was advertising his meetings with a poster that announced, "Cannibals want missionaries." And Charles laughed and thought for more reasons than one. C.T. Studd determined to take up the challenge. His doctors were against it. His wife was against it. His financial circumstances were against it. But he was convinced that God was for it, and that was enough. Muslims were sweeping down Africa, making converts, and unless a chain of mission stations was set up across the center of Africa, nothing else could stop them. Father wanted to start the first mission right in the center of this chain, plumb in the heart of Africa. In fact, he took a line from the north to south of Africa, from west to east, and he said, we're going to go right in the middle. And that's what put him just in the very northern part of the Congo. As Edith described it sent my grandmother crying and my mother weeping silently on the third floor of Hyde Park Gardens. Her helpless cries of, "Oh, Charlie, how could you?" were of no avail. He set about speaking everywhere that he could get an opening in order to collect recruits. No offer of speaking did he turn down. He slept anywhere. In 1910, at age 50, he left for southern Sudan to explore the possibilities in equatorial Africa, joining the famous CMS missionary, that's Church Missionary Society, Church of England Evangelical Mission, CMS missionary Bishop Llewellyn Gwynn. The frontline first mission based in Sudan is named the Bishop Gwynn Bible College after this same bishop. Out of 29 donkeys that went on this expedition, 25 died. On this journey, the vision for the worldwide evangelization crusade, WEC, was born. He came back to England as a man on fire. Once more, students were aroused by his meetings, and he wrote booklets in his usual hard-hitting, straight from the shoulder style, including The Chocolate Soldier. We've got this reprinted as a tract in our stands downstairs. As C.T. Studd wrote, Christ's call is to capture men from the devil's clutches and to snatch them from the very jaws of hell. To enlist and train them for Jesus, to make them a mighty army of God. But this can only be done by red-hot, unconventional, unfettered, Holy Spirit religion, by reckless sacrifice and heroism in the foremost trenches. It stirred up antagonism as well as inspiration. However, his doctor declared him medically unfit for any kind of missionary work. His great saying was, if Jesus Christ be God, and if he died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him. In 1911, he presented his chocolate soldier message at Cambridge University. The dons, that's the lecturers, filed out in silent disapproval during his chapel service, but the undergraduates were intrigued at his audacity. Edith comments to me, my father's goings-on were quite simply incomprehensible. As a family, we'd had enough adversity. To go out and seek more was sheer madness. There was no doubt that he was a man of extraordinary vision and compelling presence. His messages were charged with challenge, humor, and emotion, but it was his realism in living out his own message that attracted those who were looking for sincerity in a world of fashionable poses. It was at this stage that Edith's fiancé, Alfred Buxton, who was studying at Cambridge to become a doctor, volunteered to join C.T. Studd's Heart of Africa mission. She took her fiancé to one of her dad's meetings, not knowing that he would be the one recruit that would go forward. Naturally, this caused a hue and cry from the Buxton family, who said how unwise it was to go with this harebrained man, as some called him. At the farewell meeting in 1913, at which C.T. Studd and Alfred Buxton were to speak, C.T. spoke with his usual aplomb and zest. The difficulties were great, he said, but he didn't care a brass button. As Edith commented, off to Africa they went, one too old and the other too young. 1913, they set off again for Central Africa, this time accompanied by his daughter's fiancé, young Cambridge graduate Alfred Buxton. Together they were the pioneers of what was then called the Heart of Africa mission, but would later become Worldwide Evangelization Crusade. They followed in the footsteps of Henry Morton Stanley through Kenya and Uganda to northeastern Congo. Soon Edith was again in the swim of my frivolous life. Tea, as you could only find in Scotland. Scones of every kind, butter in glass dishes. Homemade jams and cakes baked to perfection. Fun and laughter was everywhere. Life was bright and gay. How easy to stay and be caught up in this life of grace and ease. Edith volunteered to work in the Salvation Army Mothers Hospital and worked in the wards for 6 months. Learning all I could. The first baby case I attended in the theatre laid me low on the floor. Not a good sign, I suppose, for midwifery. Fainted the sign of blood. Landing at Mombasa, C.T. Studd and Alfred Buxton travelled by bicycle through to the Congo. Father trained his mind from early days to look on every problem as an opportunity. In fact, I've known him to say that he welcomed tight corners if only to see how God would get him out of them. Bicycles, cried the trader. Do you mean to say you're going to bicycle through the jungle? Certainly, said C.T. We'll get to the other side more quickly, and when they can't carry us, we will carry them. He had an answer for everything, and a faith big enough for any situation. On the incredible trek across the continent, they faced cannibals, wild animals, tropical diseases, the maddening zing of mosquitoes, strange night sounds, the fierce Balenga tribe who had killed Emin Pasha. They were warned that they would never get through the Balenga tribe alive. Hair-raising experiences such as that of an English elephant hunter who had recently been shot with a poison arrow by the Balenga tribe died. Just failed to deter either Alfred or CT. They'll be too interested in our bicycles to do anything to us, he said. Massive trees, so tall that they turned midday sun into twilight. Vegetation steamed with heat. Monkeys swung and gibbered at them. The myriad sounds of tiny insects, creaking branches and birds. They felt as though 1,000 eyes were staring through the thick bushes watching them. They were lost in the primeval jungles. They met cannibals with teeth filed down to sharp points. They suffered repeated bouts with fever. CT referred to fevers as like being repeatedly dunked by the devil. The fever mounted, the weakness increased, all medicines failed. If they're any sick, let them call for elders of the church and let them anoint them with oil. Here's the oil. Neither salad oil, olive oil, not even linseed oil to be possessed. Well, what's the matter with the lamp oil? Why not? It's oil, and that's all the book says. We can't afford to be narrow-minded. C.T. Studd recorded that this I knew next morning that whereas I was sick, nigh to death, now I was healed. They travelled through the Ituri forest, where Stanley once travelled. The forest was very beautiful in places, like marching through an endless cathedral. They travelled through territory where a Belgian officer with a troop of soldiers had been massacred to the last man by the cannibals. To these very cannibals, C.T. and Alfred preached. Their first baptisms took place in the crocodile-infested river. While missionaries were baptizing the candidates, they were also having to fight the water to keep the crocodiles at bay. Literally baptizing with one hand and shooting with the other. As he suffered malaria and other attacks, C.T. Studd wrote, "Some like to live within sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell." In 1916, he left England for the last time, taking with him a party of 8 missionaries, including his young daughter Edith, who was coming out to marry her fiancé Alfred Buxton, who presumably she had by now forgiven. Later, another daughter, Pauline, with her husband Norman Grubb, joined the mission, and soon the number of missionaries had grown to 40. Edith Buxton describes herself as a reluctant missionary indeed. That's the title of the book, Reluctant Missionary. When she was 24 years old, she joined her father on the SS Elizabeth to travel to Congo and marry Alfred Buxton. "I'll die. I know I'll die. I shan't be able to stick it," she wrote. At one of the first services in the Congo, she remembers the words of one hymn. "Death cometh once. Hear now his tread. Soon shall you and I be lying each within a narrow bed." And she remembered wondering which one of us will get to pick on first. During the eventful 4-month journey up the Congo River, that's how long it took, Edith lost her engagement ring while throwing out the water from a wash basin overboard. My engagement ring flew off my hand, plopped in the mighty Congo River, and she felt this was a bad omen. More than 4 years had passed since I'd last seen Alfred. Immediately I held my breath. So acute was the anticipation, the dread of what I might feel. However, their reunion was warm and better than anything she could have expected. After their river journey, there's another month trek on foot. If you were to draw a line through the centre of Africa from north to south, again from east to west, there would be Nala. She found Nola a tidy, clean, well-spaced village. Avenues of palm grown several years ago by the Belgians, interspersed with small and big houses, a church and a schoolhouse. They were built of mud and thatch in the simplest fashion. All of this had been Alfred's work. And into the bargain, he had completed the first stage of writing the Belunga vocabulary. They sometimes travelled by canoe past herds of hippopotamus. They then had to trek to Naangara, where the Belgian district commissioner was waiting to conduct the first white wedding in the heart of Africa. So far, the Belgian officials were not permitted to bring their wives with them because this part of the country was not considered civilized or safe enough. Father was quite blatantly unconventional. The church at home he had thought of as becoming more like a building than a way of life. He had not been ordained. He read in his Bible, which was a constant guide as to how the early Christians went about things, and he would do the same. So that he baptized, dedicated, married, and gave communion and buried in a simple African village church. Morning prayers were at 7 a.m. when the whole village would turn up. Work began at 7:30 or so. They'd raise the roof for the hymns of Moody and Sankey translated into Mbangala. Once a man got up and told us a story of such relish that every hair turned in his direction. I was so interested, I whispered to Alfred, "What's he saying?" Alfred replied, "He's just told us he's sorry he has to confess he has eaten his uncle." The prayer meeting every Friday night was a thing to remember. Outside in the dark, the palm trees rustled gently in the evening breeze. Inside, you could see some 200 bowed figures, the oiled bodies shining in the light of the palm oil lamp. Gemisi, the converted cannibal and ex-soldier, was the church warden. He would take it upon himself the duty of prowling around, and if by chance he caught anyone with their eyes open, he'd give their heads a good dunk. Until that's no way to behave in God's house. When a man went on praying too long, carried away by this new wonderful experience of talking to God, my father would say, "Now we'll sing a hymn while our brother finishes." Father always said that as long as we missionaries travelled first class, lived out of tins and ate bread and butter, drank tea, the world would never get evangelized. We learned from Africans how to make oil from flying ants. We made sugar from sugarcane. We took to making packing cases into furniture. We were always warned not to get too posh, that it would make more barriers between us and the Africans we were trying to reach. Aside from cannibals, there was occasional incidents with leopards, crocodiles, and snakes, and after a leopard seized somebody, C.T. Studd took to sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. At the end of the second year in Africa, Edith's daughter Susan was born. C.T. took an original precaution. He had an arrangement with the drum of each village between Nala and Naangara, where the only doctor was. After Susan was born, Africans swarmed to see her, gazing pop-eyed at the first white baby they'd ever seen. Susan was a very aware child. On one of our journeys by canoe, she shrieked like a 16-year-old every time we shot the rapids and whirled into cascading torrents. Gunutu was a big, strong Azandi who walked 200 miles to come and hear about God. I've always wanted to know about God, so my wife and I packed up once, and here we are. When is the first lesson? He never missed a meeting, whether the early morning one with the workmen, or the Friday night prayer meetings, or the Sunday services. He was always there, sitting quietly with an intent look in his face. Soon he was taking part in the larger prayer meetings. His prayers were short and eager words. I felt the presence of God among us in the quiet night. He rose quickly to be a leader and finally became the head of the boys' school. Edith also related the story of a man at Ibambi who had died and was being carried to his grave. When he sat up with cries of terror, everyone scattered in every direction. The man told the story, "I've been with God. He knew my name. And I heard the gospel at Ibambi. God said, you shall go back to your village for 10 days. Send for the preacher. Accept the message. Then you will come back to me." 10 days later, he declared, "Now I'm going back to God." Then he very simply lay down and died. Jabori, an Azandi chief living in Nala, related to Alfred that one night, many years before missionaries had arrived, God met him in his sleep and said, "White people will come. They will come with a message from me. Listen carefully, do what they tell you. Until then, only do what is right." This is one of the first books produced by Norman Grubb with C.T. Studd in Congo Forest. And these are some of the pictures that they published, the dugout canoes, and some of the interesting headgear worn by the Meiji tribe, and the chief near Nala, and Sambo, the first Nala Christian. These are other pictures that you get in Norman Grubb's book, map showing the northeastern Belgian Congo occupied by the Heart of Africa mission. You can see Nala right smack there in the middle. And by the way, just across the way is Sudan is Maridi, where we first started our work in Sudan. Maridi, not too far from Mundri. And he seriously considered Maridi, but then determined that the malaria was too bad there. And so ended up in the Congo rather than in Sudan. And this just marked as an African home in the forest with a background of banana trees. Child with bound head, a custom common to most tribes. Mama Yango, one of Congo's greatest Christians, as a blacksmith, the small photo shows him as a non-professional, unpaid Christian teacher. So these are just some of the pictures published at that time by Norman Grubb. Another man, Mai, had no ears. One day Edith could restrain her curiosity no longer, and she asked, Mai, where are your ears? Madam, I've eaten them. Eaten them? I exclaimed in astonishment. Yes, eaten them, said Mai calmly. Long ago I was a slave in a chief's village. My life was hard and I did much work and was never paid. One day I talked with one of the chief's wives and together we decided to run away. The chief sent his soldiers after us and a big pot was put out to boil and I saw the woman laid in the ground and dismembered limb by limb and limb by limb put in the pot to boil before her own still conscious eyes. Slowly she is caught and boiled up to eaten, and then it was my turn next. Suddenly into the circle comes the chief's head wife. Gesticulating widely, she says, "Oh, chief, it is not good to eat a child. Curses will come upon us. We shall die." My fate was turned. Instead, the chief gives judgment that I'm to eat my own ears. Ah, Mama, it was terrible. I was very, very ill for days. On one Sunday evening, word arrived that Nancy, from the girls' school, had been caught by Chief Abiagama on her way back to school. He has kept her prisoner. We have been to the village already to demand her back, but he will not let her go. Nothing appealed to Father more than an adventure of this kind. He immediately ordered the alarm to be blown on a bugle in the centre parade ground. It was not long before all the Christians of the village poured out. Father from the top of the steps addressed the eager crowd. He was no pacifist, but on this occasion he ordered everyone to lay down their weapons and go to the rescue of Nancy as Christians and not as soldiers. There was a murmur of disappointment in the crowd. It must have been an hour's trek through the forest before we came to the chief's village. But long before our arrival, we'd heard the drums beating and the grunting cries of the dancers, and as we approached, we saw a circle of about 200 men dancing. Oiled bodies gleaming, bunch of feathers on every head, they swayed in time to the drum. Father orders men to break through the circle. We all poured in after him. They stopped opposite the chief, and Father, seizing the chief by the beard, demanded the return of Nancy. The chief backed away, saying, I'll fetch her. But Father, not to be taken in, followed in pursuit. The Christians fell upon the tribesmen with bare fists. There was never heard such a thumping and pounding. And in the darkness, all you could see was feathers of the warriors and the flying skirt tails of the Christians as they laid into one another. One of the chief's wives made her way on all fours through the melee of legs. She reached Father when she quickly took his little finger in her teeth and bit it as only a cannibal can. I gave her a thump which sent her sprawling in the dust. Nancy took advantage of the noise to escape back to Nala. Where do you get stories like this? As I said, the most brutally honest missionary biography I've ever read. As Edith said, there's no place like Africa, find me out. And in a voice begins to speak. What are you doing? When man listens, God speaks. God can speak to the human soul through the enlightened conscience. I began to put things right as far as I could see. And with my obedience to what I believe God was trying to say to me, there came a change, a sense of God's presence. I experienced a new peace and relaxation in the battle of life. She described Alfred as with such quick intelligence, able to work 16 hours a day, able to eat anything, sleep anywhere, do without anything. We had 6 years of complete and happy companionship. But then he had an illness which sounded like epilepsy. After his illness, there followed 16 years of ever-deepening anxiety, sleepless nights, and further attacks, which Alfred took with a silence and a courage that was complete. Father had made such sacrifice of himself that it was in his nature to expect much from others, and most of us could not keep up with it. If missionaries did not come up to scratch, Father felt we'd better rid of them. Alfred played the role of the peacemaker. The same thing happened in case where African Christians had fallen into sin. Father would demand the necessity of church discipline. Alfred would advocate patience and love. Each was representing the truth of the gospel, but the differences became severe. Without holiness, no one shall see the Lord. Father had been trained in law, and his letters could be very severe. He would not be put off his calling by anyone, even his wife. My father once said, you need only 1 inch of theology to every foot of practical Christian living. At 70, he mastered Kingwana and was able over the years to progress in the translation of the New Testament, the Psalms and extracts from the Proverbs into Kingwana. In 1928, C.T. Studd wrote, as I believe I'm now nearing my departure from this world, I have but a few things to rejoice in, and they are these. Number 1, that God called me to China, and I went in spite of the utmost opposition from all my loved ones. Number 2, that I joyfully acted as Christ told that rich young man to act. Celebrating. Number 3, that I deliberately, at the call of God, when alone, gave up my life for this work, which was to be henceforth not only for the Sudan only, but for the whole unevangelized world. Remember, at this stage, the whole of the hinterland of Africa was called Sudan. My only joys are therefore that when God has given me work to do, I've not refused it. To the end, Charles maintained a strenuous routine. He worked an 18-hour day. He undertook long journeys, preaching sometimes to congregations of 2,000. He read the Bible for hours each day and he poured his heart into his prayers. Then the news arrived that his wife had been left behind in England because of ill health had died. Charles now suffered several heart attacks and gallstones. In July 1931, this gallant, unconventional cricketer's innings came to an end. In 1931, the Turu forest where he had once been entertained by cannibals, he died. He died the good soldier he had lived, surrounded by the African people he loved, in whose lives he had done so much to change. It was a stormy day when they laid him to rest. 2,000 people from the surrounding forest came to his funeral, including chiefs. In assessing this incredible, bold, abrasive, and controversial missionary, his co-workers, including his sons-in-law, Alfred Buxton and Norman Grubb, recognized that his energy, his earnestness, and his single-mindedness made him a most difficult person to work with. He was stubborn and he was inflexible in what he required and demanded of others. He was eccentric. He wrote a booklet in which he said he didn't care a damn about anything except to serve Christ and to save souls. Well, that kind of language was most offensive and unacceptable. Many at that time, Victorian England, Edwardian England, you just didn't talk like that. I can't abide cowardice, he wrote. I refuse to make my God and Savior a non-entity. He was ruthless in the standards he set for himself and others, and he interpreted leisure and recreation as idleness. He laid a powerful emphasis on the need for holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. People were not sure what to make of a man who in his 50s could leave behind an ailing wife while he went to be a missionary in the most inaccessible part of earth. His love for Jesus Christ was supreme, and to many of his contemporaries he was a fanatic. As he pointed out, nobody had a problem with me being a sports fanatic, because that's what fan means. A sports fan is a sports fanatic. To be fanatical about cricket was fine, but to be fanatical about Jesus' missions is not. And he in fact, one of the books on him is called Fool and Fanatic. The mission he founded, WEC, Worldwide Evangelization Crusade, has grown to be one of the largest missions in the world today. The life of C.T. Studd will always remain a challenge to those who seek an easier path. C.T. Studd was quoted over and over in Hospital Christian Fellowship. His major part of my missionary training and The Chocolate Soldier was required reading. His daughter writes, C.T. Studd's life stands as some kind of rugged Gibraltar, a sign to all succeeding generations that it is worthwhile to lose all that this world can offer and to stake everything on the world to come. His life will be an eternal rebuke to easygoing Christianity. He has demonstrated what it means to follow Christ without counting the cost and without looking back. C.T. was essentially a cavalry leader, and in that capacity led several splendid charges when C.T. and Stanley Smith went with the Cambridge 7 to China in 1885. 10 years later, when C.T. toured the universities at the start of the student volunteers movement. And in 1910, when he initiated the campaign for the region between the Nile and Lake Chad, the largest unevangelized region in Africa at that time. These three things alone have affected missionary history. He personified the heroic spirit, the apostolic abandon. From him I learned that God's idea of a saint is not a man primarily concerned with his own sanctification. God's saint is 50% a soldier. That's again C.T. quote. God's saint is 50% a soldier. Anyone can be brave once. It is sticking to it that counts. There is a price to be paid for dedicated, selfless service, such as Father and Alfred gave to Africa. And at C.T. Studd, said those words have been quoted how many times? You only have one life, it will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last.